good evening for Keri and perhaps others. We are very excited to welcome you all, and on behalf of myself, as well as my fellow event planners, Luisa and Sarah. And so I'm speaking to you from the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Musqueam people, which is where the University of British Columbia campus is located. And this is, if we're talking about the future of universities, which is I know Keri's plan, then it's very much a relevant conversation, this question of decolonization in relation to that. And of course, the conversations look different in Europe, but I know that as Canadian institutions are thinking about their futures, this is something that's definitely on all of our minds. So I invite us to think with that as Keri invites us into her conversation. So I will introduce Keri and then tell you a little bit about the plan for today, and then I will give the floor to Keri. So Dr. Keri Facer's research and practice is concerned with understanding the relationship between education, time, past futures, and change, in particular in relation to environmental and technological factors, and developing educational practices that are ethical in complex, interdependent worlds. She's a professor of educational and social futures at the University of Bristol. From 2018 to 2020, she was a Zennstrom Professor for Climate Change Leadership at Uppsala University. And from 2012 to 2018, she led the UK's Connected Communities program, a 300 project network of university community collaborations. She's currently advising the UNESCO Futures of Education program, which has some really great materials if you're interested. She's also planting a food forest, writing a book on living in time, and trying to develop a network of civic universities to mobilize their role as anchor institutions in local communities to address climate change. So we're thrilled to have Keri with us today. I believe her talk is in two parts. So she's going to speak for a bit, and then we will break out into smaller groups to sort of debrief a bit, come back to the whole group, spend a few minutes debriefing together, and then she'll do the second part of her talk, and we'll follow the same format for that. So Keri, take it away.
Hi, thanks, and thanks Sharon and everybody at Green College for the invitation. I wondered just, well, I don't know if everybody's the same, but I'm somebody who, when I realise when the Zoom meeting is, that's the point at which I look it up and then I find the thing. And so everybody is kind of consistently late to things. So I wonder if maybe everybody could just write your discipline as closely as you can define it in the chat for me, so that I just get a little bit of a sense of who I'm talking to and what your perspectives are, and that will allow me to, well, to have a conversation with you. So that's great. Oh, kinesiology. Fantastic. Okay, that's lovely. That's incredibly helpful. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. So just to explain a little bit about this title, because, you know, I'm now speaking to something that I wrote. I wrote this at a point when, at the end of last year, I was invited to give a talk around crisis. And one of the things that I ended up doing was thinking, well, actually, we're not in the first crisis. There are many, even in the very short period of time. And I started thinking about the images that we might work with when we think about crisis in linear time. And you get this sort of kind of repeated idea of something disruptive emerging, which made me think of this. It made me think of like heart rate monitors and the sense of kind of the potential anxiety that's involved with this idea of crisis as a kind of linear moment. And I thought, well, what happens if you turn it on its side? And I realized when you turn it on its side, you can run multiple crises in relation to each other. And it starts looking a little bit more like a musical stave. So I started thinking about us living in time as a way of thinking about living in this business of music, and then discovered this. Anybody know what this is? It is the most astonishing sheet music for Tibetan throat singing. Isn't it beautiful? Anyway, one of the things that I find really interesting about this is this idea of the multiplicity of times that exist at any one moment. And so I ended up thinking about universities in time, and I was thinking about dancing in time and whether all of that might be a better and more useful metaphor for us than some of the other ways we think about things. So what I'm going to talk about today is sort of driven by that. So I was thinking about how universities ourselves, how we are kind of in time, how we ourselves think about time in the future. And then I was thinking, you know, when you're on the dance floor, often there's a mirror on the other side. So how do others see us? How do others see universities' role in the future? So I'm going to think about both of those things together. And I see a match to them, but it'd be interesting to see if you follow that. But a little bit about where I'm coming from. So just to show where I am, I'm in Bristol. We are here. We are a town of 500,000 people. We have huge social inequalities. We are deeply entangled with the history of industrialization and the emergence of industrialization, but our histories are older and deeper, and the city is deeply shaped by its role in the transatlantic slave trade. And you will all be familiar with the recent toppling of the statue of Edward Colston, who was a slave trader extraordinaire. And the city had spent many years saying it was going to do something about it and didn't, and even resisted putting a plaque up to explain his history and his complicity. And much of the city is still named after him, and there's a huge tension around that. So that's one of the struggles that we're working with here in the city. But a little bit also about where I'm coming from, and I'm increasingly defining myself as an undisciplined researcher. My background is in literature. I've worked in sociology of education. I've spent a lot of time doing co-design and collaboration, work on activism and research with climate change, and I've worked across a whole variety of different areas. Most recently, I'm focusing in particularly on education, climate change, temporality and method, and anticipation studies. But really what runs through all of my questions, and I hope this is where I can create a connection with you, is the question, how can we, and by we I mean myself, collaborators and partners, prevent change processes intensifying profound inequalities? How can we build the capacity to learn and create spaces of mutual aid and solidarity? And how can we work with and use our ideas of the future to open up new possibilities in the present? So when I use we here and throughout the presentation, I'd like you to read it as situated and as invitational rather than a universalist claim about anything I'm about to say. So, another brief note, my ontology is an assumption of interdependence, an assumption of complexity and non-linearity, an assumption that ideas of the future change, shape and reframe what we can see in the present. Okay, so all of that is a bit of like, how do we get here? Where are we? I will get to the point at some point soon. Okay. So, two halves. On the dance floor, how do universities themselves think about the future in particular? And I'm just going to keep an eye on my time, if that's okay. And I'm going to be talking here about the history of European universities. Actually, one of the things I would really love to study is to go back, for example, to the Egyptian universities and to the Chinese universities that massively predate European universities, to engage with their temporalities. And there's some fascinating work on Egyptian time that really is something that's sort of opening up new areas for me. But at the moment, I'm talking about European universities. I want to start off with thinking about the Parisian University of the 13th century. And I want to start off talking about the way in which twice a year, these universities used to run things called quadlibets, which meant that any member of the university, which in practical examples was all the clergy who had graduated from the university, were able to ask a question, and any question, of the professors. Isn't that an interesting idea? Don't you think we should do that? Any alumni of the university can come together and ask a question, and then the professors have to go and work out how to answer it, all right? So that's what happens in this situation. So what happens at this point is a lot of the clergy start having a problem with this thing called merchant time that appears, which starts basically giving all sorts of problems. So a clergyman, for example, comes to this quodlibet and says, I'm concerned about the eternal soul of one of my parishioners, because she is being invited to sort of to give an annuity, so to give money to somebody in return for them. She's going to, sorry, other way around. She's going to be paid an annuity for some use of her land. So the big question here is that usury, right? So is that making money on something? Now, the only way in which you can answer that is if you have an idea of how long this relationship is going to go on, which suddenly raises the question, who gets to tell the future? So they're bringing this question to the university and saying, well, you know, how do I answer this? Because I'm concerned with this woman's eternal soul. I'm worried about usury, but, you know, who can predict the future? So at this point, Thomas Aquinas gets involved and he says, well, what can be known by God and what can be known by man? And he basically says, well, this is his kind of definitive statement. If anyone attempts from the stars to foretell future contingent or chance events, or to know with certitude the future activities of men, he is acting under a false and groundless presupposition and opening himself to the intrusion of diabolic powers. Okay, so that's not good. Consequently, this kind of fortune telling is superstitious and wrong. But if someone uses astronomic observation to forecast future events, which are actually determined by physical laws, for instance, drought and rainfall and so forth, then this is neither superstitious nor sinful. Okay, so suddenly we've got a framing in the university that what the university is allowed to do is to proclaim what might happen in the future through a site of empirical study. Any other claims about the future, any other ways of thinking about it, they're God's work. All right, now you may be thinking this is a bit random. Why is she talking about this? But all of this stuff lays some foundations. And what it does is it starts delineating boundaries between lay and expert knowledge of the future. It establishes criteria by which different forms of knowledge about the future can be adjudicated. And it also brings with it the idea that this sort of expertise, this sort of knowledge of the future can be taught. And one of the things that I'm wondering about right now is, does this still carry on today? Are we still living with the legacy of this today, that precisely one of the values that we proclaim for the university is that it provides a particular form of temporal knowledge and foresight? Okay, so that's happening quite a long time ago. Let's shift to the Enlightenment, right? This is also a moment of significant change in relation to temporality and the role of the university in relation to the futures. So we have, with the Enlightenment, we have a massive proliferation of information sources, democratization of all sorts of publics. We also have the rise of the Royal Academies, empirical science. So there's this huge kind of seething mass of concern going on, and it sort of parallels the point that we've all just lived through, where suddenly the internet appears and we're thinking, yeah, how the hell do we deal with that? So one of the questions that comes out is, well, what knowledge is useful? And obviously Humboldt and others produce the idea of the disciplines, and the disciplines as a way of managing this mass proliferation of knowledge sources. One of the ways, Chad Wellman, brilliant book called Organizing Enlightenment, talks about this. And the critical thing with the disciplines as they emerge is that they start telling us not only how to deal with new information, which is to locate it in the history of a particular strand of thought, but they start projecting into the future the sort of information and knowledge that might be useful. So you're working historically and projecting forwards. And two big shifts happen with this. The first shift that we talk about a lot is the spatial shift. So we see the identification of universities with disciplines rather than with the state or the church as their authority. We see the practice of undermining competing other forms of knowledge. We see the exclusion of knowledge of Africa, of the East, of the Americas, of women, of everyday living as both, in Kant's terms, unreasonable and manifestly inferior. It brings powerful technical knowledge through specialization, but a huge loss of knowledge that's embedded in people and place, and it's associated with colonial and nation building projects. Now, all of you living and working in Canada, thinking through settler colonial relations, this will be very, very familiar to you. I also want to suggest, though, that there is a temporal shift, that what this does is this moment, this de-articulation of the university from state and from church, and the articulation with the discipline, creates the university as a different time. It separates the university into a different time zone from the everyday. And it reframes our accountability. And I use the word our intentionally now, those of us working in universities. It reframes our accountability as associated with the history and future of the discipline, not the world. And this is a quotation from Stefan Collini, who is one of the real advocates for a particular form of university in the UK at the moment. And you can see that this narrative, this idea of the temporality of the university, is still strong. He argues the open-ended quest for understanding has primacy over any immediate application or outcome. So what this does is, again, it retains the claim of the university as a privileged time into which to induct students as particular sorts of knowledge workers. Now, what I'm interested in is this question today and what's going on with our conceptions of time, ecology, climate change at the moment, and what that is doing to the idea of the temporality of the university. And I'd argue that ecological awareness means living with a different awareness of time. It means engaging with geological history and long distant futures. It means beginning to engage with concepts of complexity, complex time, the idea of disruptions, non-linearity, tipping points. It requires us to think about multiple and overlapping times in any one place. It's also encouraging us to think about the relationships between clock time and living time, between narratives of growth and decay. We're also seeing from some other areas, and this I do think is speaking into the ecological work, is that the work around quantum time also starting to radically disrupt the assumptions of what it means to be human today. And then we've got the time of social movements and activism. So we have the concept of time. The de Juvenal phrase is the idea of you build solidarity, you build relationships to kind of make little jetties into the future. And finally, we start thinking about the future as relational forms of commitment and care. And here we're thinking a lot about feminist futures work around time. So this is a beautiful image from my home university, which is an art installation that pulls together thousands and thousands of pieces of wood from a whole range of different places. There's some astonishingly old pieces in there. And you know, she's really trying to get to this sense of the multiple overlaying narratives of time that I also see, for example, in that Tibetan script around music. So the question is, well, you know, how does our Enlightenment European Research University equip us to deal with all of this stuff? You know, what resources does it give us to deal with this sort of thing? And on one level, I'd suggest that we've inherited a number of traditions that we're not very good at naming and that sit, if you like, across and between disciplines. They're not disciplinary. So we have traditions of scholarship that are about inquiry into ancient knowledge. So the kind of going back in order to understand other ways of being in the world. But then we've got traditions of stewardship, so caring of past into the future. And here you could think of everything from biology to classics, to modern foreign languages. All of these, as far as I'm concerned, are moments of stewardship, of keeping certain sorts of knowledges alive into the future. We've got traditions of discovery, so classic modes of scientific experimentation, which is kind of opening up the present to see what futures are in process. We've got experimentation like the making of the world, you know, the classic Abraham Lincoln phrase, it's no point predicting the future, the job is to build it, with which we've been living for years. We've got traditions of critique. So since Marxism, we've got the critique, the fundamental challenging of the colonization of the future by particular discipline, by particular ideas. And then we have modeling, and I would usually put in there imagination. I'm not quite sure why I've not put that there as well, possibly because I was thinking about the dominance of economic modeling at this point. And then praxis, the co-making of worlds with others. So in our universities, we have these many different orientations to the future, but we do a couple of things very badly. One of them is we're very bad at articulating this ourselves and thinking about how we're working with time. And two, we're really good at bringing up students who engage with one of these modes of future orientation rather than all of them. So for example, we're great at producing engineers who are able to experiment. They're less good perhaps at stewardship or at critique. Similarly, we are great at pulling out sociologists, fantastic at critique, who are maybe perhaps less good at other practices in terms of working with time. But the history of the university also gives us these other absences. We're missing lived experience, embodied experience. We're missing the temporality that's connected to and part of the cycles of land and place. We're missing the practices of care and maintenance and repair. Arguably, this is what feminist and women's traditions might have brought us had they not been eradicated from universities. And we're not particularly good in universities at creating spaces for deep reflexivity about the self in the world as an emergent practice. So this is where I'd like to stop to start the conversation and just really ask you, how do you see your discipline orienting itself to the future? What concepts of time do you work with? What are the absences that you see, absences in your own discipline's engagement with time? And how, or is an ecological consciousness, the timescales of climate change or biodiversity loss, reframing the timescale of your work? So that's to get us going. Can I hand over to you, Sharon, to organize some conversation?
Yes. So I have made rooms of 4 or 5 people, breakout rooms, and I'm wondering if maybe once we make the rooms, we can broadcast the questions, or maybe put them into the chat now, so that
yes,
know what they are when they go in there. And we're all working on diminished capacity, so we might forget.
Don't worry, I have no mental capacity to remember questions. Yeah.
And Keri, how long would you like the rooms to be open for?
Well, I think maybe 15 minutes, because these are quite hard questions. And then maybe we come back for a bit of a conversation in plenary, and then I'll move us on. Is that okay?
Great. So I will open up the rooms.
Okay, well, I'm going to move on now to this question about, if you like, the mirror. So the view from outside universities, thinking about this question of futures of higher education. So all of this comes with, a health warning, I suppose, that as soon as you use the word future or futures, you can get locked into linear temporality, which I have to say is not the only temporality that I think is appropriate for thinking about education. And there's a big, long conversation to be had about that. But for now, I'll just focus on this. So as we know, any of us who work in education, we know that the future is kind of everywhere. It sort of infiltrates everything. Noel Goff describes it as tacit, tokenistic, and taken for granted. And so one of the questions I've been working with for a very long time is, well, what happens if you take it seriously? What happens if you try to think reflexively about futures in education? And my sense is if we don't do that, then as you can see, you get these sorts of comments, the sort of Joe Biden statements, if you're, thinking about the future, Biden plan for education students in our future is to provide educators support and respect they need, support parents' income so that they're prepared to succeed in tomorrow's economy. Okay, so the future suddenly gets collapsed to a particular narrative. So what I would like to do is say, well, how do we think reflexively about futures in education? And I've been working probably for 1.5 years now with the UNESCO team around their Futures of Education initiative, which is, like all international processes, contested, conflictual, but very interesting in terms of what they're trying to do. And so what I've hit with them is actually a set of ethical questions, which is, how do we think about futures in education ethically? So I want to share this work in progress. It's a background paper that I've just finished for them that will be published shortly. And I want to suggest that there's actually 5 different ways of thinking about futures in education, and I'll talk those through, but just to give you a sort of heads up. We've got the framing of education in the future. So what might higher education look like in the future? We've got education for the future, this question of how we prepare students for the future. We've got the approach of liberating education from the future. Then we've got the growing fields of education about futures, and the final and really growing area that I think is very interesting is around what I call education healing futures, but that's probably not the right language yet, but it's a sort of a thing we're struggling towards. So just thinking about, I'll just pull these out, each one of them, and what the sort of strengths and weaknesses of these seem to be, and then think about what this might give us in terms of ethical questions. So the process of thinking about education in the future, classic question, what's it going to look like? And here we've got sort of predictive and imaginative work going on. We've got planners, we've got architects and others. In Jasanoff and King's term, what is often happening here is the projection of a socio-technical and imaginary that mobilizes action. So the really famous ones in this area tend to be produced by people like the OECD or commercial companies who are generating a vision, if you like, to mobilize particular action in the present. But we can also see that social movements are doing this as well, because one of the critical things of producing a vision is that it's a way of organizing people and bringing people together. So here we can also see in this sort of approach a kind of social utopian practice, the desire to see a vision and bring people towards it. Now, there's huge advantages to this way of working, particularly for those of us who've been in education a long time. Quite often what it allows us to do is to see education in a wider context, and to engage with the changes and developments that there are in multiple fields, rather than just in education. Sorry, screen's doing something weird. Okay. And it can be a very creative process. It can be exploratory. It can help open us up to different ways of doing things. But the problem that really characterizes most educational futures work is it's too often carried out with a very limited set of disruptions. So, for example, most of it is about how technology will change our world, but not how, for example, climate change or demographic shifts or increasing inequalities. And in terms of the intergenerational relationships, which really matters for all of this, is usually this is conducted by adults about a future, occasionally with reference to future generations. But how might future generations speak in these processes? And we can see some examples that are starting to emerge about how young people might have a say in this. So we've got projects like Burke and Grosvenor's The School I'd Like. We've got a really interesting initiative developing in Wales, which is the Commission for Future Generations, which has legal powers to change policy. And we've also got the growth of wisdom councils that are around intergenerational thinking. However, what we're also starting to see in this area is the growth of what we might call speculative futures, which is a new and I think particularly pernicious form of educational futures practice. And my colleague Ben Williamson draws attention to this very nicely by looking at the example of a company like Holon IQ, which is what they call a meta ed tech platform. And what they're doing is they're harvesting data from all around the world to make a set of predictions about what they see as likely to happen in education in order to encourage financial speculation and investment in it. So here what we see is a shift from educational futuring away from a kind of normative, desire-based approach, this is where we should be going, to a speculative approach, which is saying, how can we profit from this? And the critical issue around this is that the object of the speculation, education, is utterly irrelevant. The issue is, how do you produce money out of it? And we can also see examples in things like the hedge fund investment in student debt in the US, Canada, and the UK, which is doing the same sort of thing. So in this educational futures approach, education in the future, we've got a whole load of quite complex different actors working at the moment. Then we've got the second orientation, which I call education for the future. And this is the one that tends to dominate in amongst education practitioners. This is what a lot of us locate ourselves as doing. And I think there's two different ways. Critically, this is about the idea of education as a preparatory site for a future world, all right? So you get this concept of education as the space that we're working in because we're driven by a particular vision of the future. And the idea is that we prepare kids for that future in two different ways. And these groups tend to see themselves as opposing each other. I actually think they're part of the same kind of orientation. So the first orientation is the adaptive one, which is the idea of adaptation to a known future. So this could be either, you know, it's going to be the fourth industrial revolution. Everybody has to learn how to develop artificial intelligence, all right? Or it could be my colleagues who speak about deep adaptation. We're in the world, the future is going to be climate disaster. We have to make sure that our students kind of adapt to that situation. The other framing of education for the future is what I call agentic preparation. So this idea of you have a vision of the future and you have to figure out how to support young people to avoid it, okay? So instead of going in that direction, we have to equip them to figure out how to make something else happen. And there's all sorts of practices associated with this. Prefigurative practice, I think, is one of them. But you could look at the Sustainable Development Goals at the moment as like a massive global exercise in agentic preparation. Here's this future we want to avoid. Let's mobilize everybody to resist it. And again, thinking about the reflections on this sort of approach, there's some questions we might want to be asking ourselves. Firstly, are the sorts of futures that we're preparing for plausible? What are the basis for the sorts of claims that we're making? If we're thinking about education preparation as preparation for a future, what timescale? You know, is it reasonable to think about preparation for somebody who's about to enter a job in 6 weeks' time, or to find themselves living in a particular world in 6 weeks? That seems reasonable. If we're talking about claims about the next century, when does this start to get a bit problematic? And then thirdly, what sort of agency is assumed in this scenario, and who is being asked to take responsibility for which futures? So we know that education for climate change, for example, has been really characterized by a vision of a particular disastrous scenario, with young people being framed as agents to respond to it, which raises deeply ethical questions about our relationship and our responsibility for things like climate change as opposed to young people's. And the other critical ethical question that gets raised here is, to what extent should we be treating the future as the dominant, if you like, the preferred timescale to shape education? What about the interests and the concerns in the present? How is it appropriate to frame it in this preparatory way? Okay. Third orientation to the future, and this ties in, Daniela, I think, with some of the things that you were saying about that creation of a moment of time that escapes, if you like, linear temporality, is this notion of emergentist or presentist education, which is really oriented towards liberating education from the future. Now, this has a whole set of different groups, and I'm gathering them all together, and most of them won't see themselves as combined, okay? But I think there's a similar kind of impetus here. So firstly, you've got the kind of traditions of critical pedagogy that are challenging the idea that there is an inevitable future that you have to work towards, and that is instead trying to say, look, we could do things differently. It's got some overlaps with agentic preparation, but it's less about realizing a particular known future. But then we have all the work in educational philosophy, where we might draw on people like Biesta or Jan Maschlein, who argue that education has a distinctive temporality, and that is precisely what constitutes the education moment. One of the people that I draw on particularly here is Deborah Osberg, who describes education as precisely a moment of symbiotic anticipation, which is why we've got the picture of this Portuguese man of war on the side, because the Portuguese man of war is a co-emerged symbiote that becomes something different from the encounter of smaller and different elements. And that's the sort of thing that Osberg is talking about. She says education is precisely the moment where we bring together all the different knowledges or experiences, identities, stories that we have to bring into that particular setting to create something new. And that new is not known by us. So this is where it provides a distinct break from the idea of education for preparation, is that it's fundamentally oriented towards the generation of something different that cannot be known in advance. And here, I think we also want to start bringing in the relativistic physics work, so Carlo Rovelli's work on time, posthumanism, complexity theory, which really disrupts the idea of the human as kind of master of themselves that has dominated kind of modernist thinking. So if the human is not, if you like, in control of themselves or of the world, then the concepts of agency that we're working with have to be very, very different. And to me, I end up coming back to Keats's concept of negative capability here, which is the idea of an education as a practice of kind of sitting in that complexity, of not reaching, not striving for certainty. And as a colleague of mine from Goa keeps pointing out, he says, look, this is just the West catching up with Jainism and Buddhism. You know, there's been a lot of thinking about this for a very long time. So, you know, and absolutely. This attention, though, towards attentiveness, attunement, and listening, I think comes out particularly strongly in this sort of work. So some reflections on this orientation to the future. Well, I'm very persuaded by it as a practice. It creates conditions of emergence for something new, but there are risks and concerns, which is what happens when we don't have a narrative of a kind of shared vision or coordination in a world when so many other people are selling particular visions of the future. It feels to me that it connects back to Arendt's framing of the crisis of education and the purpose of education, which I won't read now, but those of you who know this will be familiar with it. Those of you who aren't, just have a look at Arendt's essay on the crisis in education. But clearly, her point, and I think that's what's coming out of this, is the idea of education as a space for creating something new, something unforeseen, but also preparing students in advance for the task of renewing a common world. But what she manages to avoid there is the idea of defining in advance what that common world will be. And the fourth orientation that I've been working with, sorry, this is a bit of a list. I realize it doesn't kind of tell a story, but I will get there, okay? Is the growing field of education, if you like, about the future. And here, this isn't actually the right phrase. It's not about the future. It's education about how we think about the future. And here there's two really important different fields. So one field is futures literacy, and this draws on futures education, which draws on peace studies, which is really oriented towards reflecting on our assumptions about what the future is, what it might be, and how we, if you like, use ideas of the future in the present to create possibilities. But then along that sort of work is really fascinating, but it's often very decontextualized, it's very universalized. One of the big fights I'm having with some of my lovely colleagues at UNESCO is how to not universalize futures literacy as another literacy that then produces a whole load of illiteracies. I think we need to pluralize this, and if literacy is even the right concept, okay? So there's some contention around this. But it does offer tools that are really fascinating and really useful for conversations. Alongside this, we've got Arjun Appadurai's work on the capacity to aspire. And Appadurai argues that the capacity to aspire is not evenly distributed. Now, I had a bit of a disagreement with him about this because I read it as him defining this as kind of intrinsic to people. And his framing suggests that, if you like, those who are poor have less capacity to aspire. Now, when you look at his work, what he's actually saying is that the capacity to aspire is learned, it's an experience, and it depends on the resources you have available with you to experiment in the world in order to see what futures might be, and then in order to organize and mobilize resources in order to achieve that. So I think there's something very interesting in how these two concepts speak to each other, both in terms of this idea of reflexivity about how we think about the future, but also this question of social stratification. So are there different conditions that make it easier for people to reflect on futures or not? So I've done that reflection. My concern about this work, however, is actually I don't think that pedagogically they take the ontological implications of their work seriously. So quite often, particularly in futures literacies, they will be saying that the future is emergent, is not knowable. But the pedagogic practices are quite often conventional banking models. Okay, so we know what this is and we're going to deliver it at you. So I think that is where there's a real gap and a weakness at the moment to work on, and it's something to work on. And then finally, I want to highlight the emergence of a practice that I call building on Arathi Sriprakash's work, reparative futures, which is, and I would frame it as the return of memory to futures work. And the argument here is that you cannot make futures without healing pasts, that the presents are made up of multiple histories and different experiences, and that these need to engage as part of the process of creating and imagining different futures. So, and Arathi and colleagues argue, reparative futures cannot be based either on systematic silences or on oppositional modes of remembering. It requires recognizing that we are all differently marked by historical processes, that we all have capacities for affect and cognition, and that dialogue, however challenging and difficult, is a starting point for all educational relationships that are self-consciously oriented toward material justice. We must not come to inhabit a future that carries with it uninterrogated injustices of the past and present. It is precisely through education that new forms of recognition of these injustices and a solidarity for creating something different that can be fostered. Education is therefore necessary for reparative futures. So you'll see this to me is a distinctively different orientation to futures in education from the previous categorizations. What it also does is it starts, and there are others working in this, particularly the historian Jenny Anderson, to historicize futures thinking itself as a practice that has historically been associated with particular modernist Western projects and has been deeply tied up with and complicit with military industrial thinking. So out of those framings, my question is, well, what's the ethics of educational futures? How might we approach this? And I'm pulling out kind of 9 key elements that I can see. So this is very fresh and very new. So I'm really happy to talk with you about this and see if it makes sense to you. So fundamentally, if we're thinking about futures in education, to me, we need to be operating with these principles of reflexivity and multiplicity, asking ourselves, what are the nature of the knowledges and whose knowledges are used to create ideas of the future? Of transparency. So how do we talk about the processes by which these ideas of the future are produced? I want to promote the idea of curating decay. This ties in, Sharon, to your work and to Vanessa's on hospicing modernity, which is about thinking about what harmful practices need to be allowed to decay in order to allow others to emerge. So rather than thinking of futures in education just as the shiny thing over there that we move towards, it's also about letting things go. About principles of repair and healing, thinking about what are the injustices upon which the futures that are envisaged are being based upon and how are they being addressed. Principles of intergenerational inquiry, how might principles of intergenerational justice inform the practice? Of emergence and observation, so if we're operating with an ontology of complexity, of non-linearity, how do we think about what happens after these futures are envisaged and put in the world? How do we take care for their consequences? How do we keep attending to them? So I'm always drawn to Bergson's framing of us walking into the future backwards and seeing what emerges. Of organizing hope. So one of my questions, what is the role of these futures that we're working with in creating hopeful politics and practices in the present? And Sharon and I were having an interesting conversation during the break about the role of hope in futures. And then two final points are not really ethical principles, they're more like statements of what we have to do. How does this work? How does any educational futures work that we might be doing limit the pathological speculative practices that I've talked earlier? How can they limit the extractive educational futures work that is going on? And then finally, how can the distinctive temporality of education be preserved in the educational futures work that we might be doing? So that's where I've got to. So for discussion, I suppose I might ask yourselves what assumptions about the future underpin your practices as educators, what intergenerational relationships frame your educational encounters, and how it is your educational practice oriented towards repair of past injustices. So these were questions I thought we might have a conversation around, maybe quite briefly, because it's 6:45 whatever time it is with you. It's 6:45 with me. But I thought maybe I could take these questions and pop them in the chat, but we could just go into the breakout rooms again really briefly and then come back for a plenary. Would that be all right?
Well, I was talking behind the scenes with my co-host, and we were thinking, since we only have like less than 15 minutes and a lot of people have had to leave, that maybe we would just do a big group.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Cool. I will stop sharing and we can just have a conversation.
Keri, I don't know if it's a question, it's maybe just an observation. What you said about this asking people to identify, number one, their desires, and then what's driving their desires seems really important to me, because even in all of the very real differences between the kind of futures you were discussing, in many cases, although the content is different, the sort of frame of the driving factors seem to be similar, that there's this desire for some exceptional group to define the future, whether it's the hegemonic or the revolutionary. There's a desire to control what will happen. There's a desire for certainty, a desire for security, a desire for hope. And those things are incredibly difficult to interrupt. And it's not through describing them that we can interrupt them. That's where the sort of embodied and relational and affective pieces of all of this come in as well. Yes, we need to have the intellectual discussions about it, but so much of it is what's happening sort of on these unconscious levels. And a lot of it is in relation to this thing as well, as you said, which is there's so many other ways of imagining and relating to the future, or just other ways of imagining and relating. And it's incredibly difficult to even get students or colleagues to sense that there's something they don't know.
Yeah.
They think that we still are trapped in this sort of all-seeing God's eye view situation. And it's very difficult to interrupt that or show someone or have them sense that there's something they don't know. And it's fine. As Daniela was talking about, the place where your students got to, which is, oh, I never thought about this. This is new for me. I don't know what to do, is incredibly generative. But actually getting to that place is very difficult and people are not used to it. So even when they get there, they sometimes run away.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you've just, I guess if I had to formulate a question, is there something about the sort of beyond the intellectual, the sort of affective and relational pieces of this as well?
Yeah, you're really right. I sent an early version of this to Marcus Bussey in Australia, and he went, "It's all too cognitive," and I was like, "Yeah, I know." Well, there's two things for me in terms of how we start creating spaces with our students in universities around this. First of all, we have to just tell students we're going to pass them whatever they do, right? We you know, that's the situation that we're working with, and we're working with a bunch of people who have been brought up to think that they have to perform and they have to know, and if they don't know, they're going to fail. So how do you create a situation in which it is okay and acceptable to not know? Well, it goes entirely against the entire kind of tail wagging dog setup that we have in universities at the moment. So unofficially, I think we have to find ways, knowing that this is recorded, of telling our students that they will pass, right? That to me is like the first step. The second thing is I think untangling knowledge from agency is really, really critical. So there's a practice that I do that is embodied, that is about, we map out on the floor a kind of axis around certainty and uncertainty. So how much do I think I know about the future and how much I don't know? And then crossing that, what agency do I have and what don't I have? And that creates 4 quadrants, and we invite people to stand in them. And then we ask them to explain why, if you like, their quadrant where they know the future and what has to be done is the right one, or where they don't know and what they don't know what to do is the right one. And then we invite them to move to the area that they find hardest to deal with, all right? What can you not imagine yourself being in? And then we get them to shift to that group and to explain why that's the right place to be. And when that workshop and that process works, it's really emotional and traumatic, actually, because it really unsettles things for people. But what it also critically does is it allows people to think about when is it useful to work in these different positions. So sometimes when do I just have to assume I know some stuff and have some agency? And when do I have to go, I know nothing, I'm just going to let it go? And it's allowing people to know that they can move through those states rather than thinking you have to adopt one. And that to me is a critical thing. I don't think I want to move everybody into a constant process of unknowing and uncertainty, or to a constant process of knowledge. I want to support people to know when and how these modes of being are helpful. And again, I think that helps in terms of giving people permission to be vulnerable and to not know, is by saying you don't have to do this forever.
Wonderful. Well, I feel bad that I took the last question as the host, but we are at our time. Thank you so very much, Keri, for prompting these conversations that I have a sense will continue for many of us. And it sounds like you're willing to also be contacted if people want to continue the conversation. And I think maybe it's something that we can continue to talk about at Green College too, because I know there's a lot of interest in these questions and a lot of anxiety, speaking of the affective. So having these tools helps us ease some of the anxiety. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you for the invitation. And I'll send you a couple of links, Sharon, of papers and things that are relevant in case colleagues want to sort of engage with any of it more deeply. And please, feel free to come back and have a conversation. But thank you for all of your time and your engagement. I really appreciate it. So yeah, have a lovely day.
Oh,
Bye.
have a lovely evening.
Yes. Okay.